What are the obligations of employers and employees during a period of working notice? I'm Norm McGinnis at BAR-eX Communications, and I'm talking to Stuart Rudner, who practices commercial litigation with a particular focus on employment law at the Toronto office of Miller Thompson. First of all, Stuart, how common is working notice?
Working notice is not particularly common, and I think most employees work based upon the assumption that if they're going to be let go, they're entitled to a quote-unquote package, and many managers have that assumption as well, and they don't really give much thought to the idea that in some cases it might be perfectly reasonable and in the company's best interest to provide working notice instead.
Mm-hmm. And if working notice is provided, what's the obligation of an employee during that period?
During the working notice period, the employee certainly has to continue attending at work, performing all of their duties, with the only exception being that the employer is required to provide the employee with reasonable opportunities to look for new work. And the courts are very clear that the purpose of the notice period is to provide the dismissed employee with a reasonable or a fair opportunity to look for new work. So, for example, employees should be allowed to make telephone calls to potential employers, send faxes, send emails, and even attend at interviews during working hours, always falling back upon the description of reasonable in order to try to determine how much time they can take away from the job.
Mm-hmm. And if an employee has been given working notice, is it possible for an employer to dismiss that employee for cause while the employee is working out the notice period?
It definitely is, and a relatively recent decision of Madam Justice Karakatsanis in the Contapetus and Coventry Lane case is a good example of that, where you had someone who was provided with working notice, but in that case, Mr. Contapetus just seemed to disappear quite frequently during the notice period, wouldn't be at work, wouldn't provide any explanation, and he was repeatedly warned that that was not acceptable, and in fact warned that he would be dismissed if that continued. And I guess the straw that broke the camel's back was when he disappeared at 11 o'clock one day, didn't come back until the next day, and he was dismissed, and the dismissal was found to be appropriate in court. And so that case is a good reminder that you can dismiss someone for just cause during the notice period. There are some comments in that decision that suggest that the notice period is no different than any time before during the employment relationship, and that has to be taken in the context of this case where the employee was disappearing, but there was no suggestion in the evidence that he was leaving work to look for a new job. The evidence was simply that he would disappear without any explanation at all.
Mm-hmm. And if he had been we had provided an explanation as we were looking for work, again, depending on how much time he took and how reasonable that was, that would have been permissible.
Yeah, and that's where you get into the analysis of whether what he was doing and the amount of time he was missing was reasonable. In that case, the judge didn't even have to perform that analysis because there was no evidence that he was looking for work. He just seemed to be missing in action.
And are there reasons why working notice is not particularly, I guess they're fairly obvious, aren't they, why working notice is not a particularly common? Disgruntled employees may not be motivated to work to the fullest of their ability during that period.
Yeah, I think that's probably the lesser of the evils. I mean, in many cases, it's clear you're not going to want to have someone around if you've let them know that they're going to be dismissed. If they have access to sensitive information, if they are a client contact, or if you think they're the type of person who will just have a negative effect on morale, it's not worth keeping them on. But there are many cases where someone can continue to come to work. They're not dealing with confidential information. They're not dealing with the public, and any impact on morale might be minimal at most. And even if their performance is not what it was beforehand, at least you're getting something for the money you're paying them, as opposed to just giving them severance where you're paying them to do nothing at all.
Mm-hmm. And I guess there might be also an opportunity for the employee to train, although again that depends on the attitude of the employee, but to train a new person to take over the job in some cases.
Well, that's one way in which the employer can use the notice period. Again, as you say, depending upon the attitude of the employee. The benefit to the employee is that in many contexts, the old saying is that it's easier to find a job when you have a job. So it's often easier for someone to be looking for a job and providing a work number and a work email address, and appearing as, applying as someone who already has a job, as opposed to applying as someone who has lost their job and is now seeking something new. So it can have a benefit for the employee as well. But the other point I would make, and it comes from a New Brunswick Court of Appeal decision known as Bramble and Metis Health and Pharmaceutical Services in 1999, and that's one of the very few cases I'm aware of that has considered the employer obligations during the notice period, and specifically the obligation to provide reasonable opportunity to look for new work. That court was quite clear that the whole purpose of the notice period is to give the employee a chance to look for new work. And the court goes on to say that the weight given to a working notice period will depend upon the quality of that opportunity. And then an Ontario case from 1987 known as Kelly and Monenko Consultants, although it's an earlier decision, it really follows up on that point by saying that where the employee has no meaningful opportunity to look for new work during the notice period won't be a legitimate notice period. In that case, the employee was stationed in Nigeria and clearly had little or no opportunity to look for a new job until they got back to Canada, which was the end of the notice period. And the court found that the notice period was invalid and ordered the employer to pay damages equivalent to what the notice period should have been. So that's an extreme example of where the notice period becomes meaningless and the courts will not find it to be a valid notice period. What you have, I think, in most cases where people do try to use working notice is something in between, where you really have to balance the obligation to provide a chance to look for new work with the obligation on the part of the employee to continue carrying out their duties during the notice period.
I think in that case a lot would depend on the nature of the work, wouldn't it? Obviously, an office employee sitting at a desk has a far greater opportunity to carry on doing his or her work, and at the same time to be looking for other work, to take phone calls, to send letters and emails and so on, than someone working in a body shop, as in the case of Mr. Contapides, or working on a factory floor.
Definitely, and that's where it will come down to the use of the term reasonable. That's what the courts have used, and unfortunately there has not been a lot of analysis by the courts as to what what reasonable is. But that's what employers will have to take into account if they are seeking to give someone working notice.
So, Stuart, in conclusion, should employers consider the option of giving working notice?
I think there are definitely many contexts where they should, and many contexts now where employers don't even give it a thought, where at least they could have some benefit by providing working notice and getting some work or productivity out of the individual.
Okay. And nevertheless, the employer has to bear in mind that they have to give the employee reasonable time to seek new employment while they're working out the period of notice.
Yeah, if the employer does decide to go the working notice route, they definitely have to provide a reasonable chance for the employee to look for new work. But they and the employee have to keep in mind that the employee is still required to carry out their duties and to behave appropriately. Otherwise, they can be dismissed for cause even during the notice